What up, AP Worlders? All right, so I promised you that we'd have a quick shot through the rest of decolonization, and I'm no liar. We have count them, three slides to get through, and we're done with decolonization. So let's get to it. We're looking at Africa, and last time we were talking about kind of what happened with Palestine and Egypt, and so now we're moving into the heart of the continent, and we're shifting into a different empire. We're looking at the French to begin. Okay, so again, same thing as the British. After World War II were done, the French were extremely fatigued. And to be fair, unlike the British, the French had lost, World War II. I mean, they were taken over by the Nazis already in 1940. They didn't do very well, and so it was not going to go extremely well in Africa. Algeria was kind of the French version of India. That was like their crown jewel. And there were lots of protest movements there, again, following the lead of earlier places like India, desiring greater freedoms and a chance for independence. There was repression, a crackdown. There was violence used towards protesters and people seeking independence. And so it turned into a violent control over the territory of Algeria. Okay, so basically what happens is a guerrilla-style war breaks out, much like what happened in Vietnam. And after almost a decade of fighting, we have over 100,000 people dead. Eventually, Charles de Gaulle would become the French president, creating a new government, the Fifth Republic of France. And one of his very first things that he had to deal with is what to do with the Algerian crisis. And ultimately, he allowed Algeria to gain its independence. It's at the same time that Frantz Fanon, who's a real popular writer of the 1950s and 60s, started to release some popular works about, violence being justified or okay in the attempt for decolonization or to remove yourself from an imperial empire. So these ideas gain traction because Algeria gains its independence. Other African states or nations also desire independence as well. An example of that would be in Ghana. In 1960, Ghana had been able to negotiate its independence with the United Nations. Nkrumah was one of the great kind of figures or the personalities of African independence movements. And Nkrumah basically, his idea was to try to use the United States as almost like visual propaganda and kind of copy their idea. And so I put on here like currency, anthems, monuments. He really tried to create that kind of like Americana, but for Ghana instead, right? So very American-esque. And it actually at times kind of drew some criticism for being so positive towards a different imperial power. But basically, the real heart of what we get from movements like what happened in Ghana was the idea of Pan-Africanism, or like this concept that African states were kind of inherently bonded together. And so, for example, the Organization of African Unity, or the OAU, kind of pushed this idea that African nations should support one another in their attempts for independence against imperial European colonial powers. Other areas where we kind of see a similar sense of this kind of like Pan-African idea is also something called Black nationalism. So across the continent of Africa, there was a kind of a solidarity in their Blackness. That became a cultural rallying cry. Islam also serves that role. We see a lot of Islamic states or Islamic populations using its Islamic religion as a sense of unity with other Islamic states that are also looking for independence. It creates kind of like this global community of support. All right, so moving on to our last couple African examples, and we're going to switch our focus now into the heart of the continent of Africa. Okay, so Kenya was a much more violent, a much more militant reality. England was extremely unpopular in Kenya by the 1940s. White British landowners had basically taken all of the good land and left all the junk to the actual people there. And so the Mau Mau revolution begins, and rebels basically make an attempt to intimidate, remove British landowners. And so the British crack down on this movement. They send in the military as kind of a quasi-police force. Anyone who's caught protesting, leading demonstrations are jailed. So Kenyatta was like the big leader of this movement, and so he was thrown in jail. However, right, there is kind of a change of heart as things get sorted out and kind of clarified. England, I don't want to say reverses its stance, but tries to allow for a more peaceful transition of power. They allow different political parties to grow, and after a democratic process is taken, they do allow Kenya to assume independent control once there's a government and a clear system for leadership. And so then Kenyatta will become kind of the transitional figure into the birth of a new nation, Kenya. Okay, the last one they want to focus on is maybe the most important of the different African nationalist phenomenon, and that is South Africa. Going way back, South Africa had a really tumultuous history. I mean, we go back, the Portuguese were there already in the 16th century. The Dutch then claim this territory. The British come in and fight the Dutch. Excuse me. And so it's been very tense. Numerous wars have been fought there, and it had always been racially divided, with Dutch landowners and then eventually British landowners literally removing and forcing the local African populations to yield or give them the best land. Okay, and so proof of that is this Afrikaner National Party. Those would have been white British landowners. Actually, traditionally, they would have had Dutch heritage. But basically, they wanted to divide society into a separate but equal society where there was whites only and black only territories. We call that apartheid, right? The separation of blacks and whites in South Africa. Okay, this was extremely controversial, but whites held great privilege, and so that was kind of the policy for a while. The African National Congress, led by Nelson Mandela, pictured down here, starts to challenge that, right? So there's boycotts, protests, demonstrations, sit-ins. Again, this would happen around the similar time period as a lot of the civil rights movement in America and some of the pushes for better treatment, civil rights in Ireland. And so they all kind of work together at this time to create a civil rights movement globally. Nelson Mandela eventually is jailed for his involvement in protest against the apartheid of South Africa. And then eventually the African National Congress will win some elections. I mean, we're talking like after 20 years of continued struggle, and Nelson Mandela will become the first black president of South Africa. Right? So going from a protester to being in jail, to being freed, to being elected the president of the state, right? And undoing apartheid and bringing blacks and whites together in a unified and free South African state. Okay, and our last topic then, the last thing that we want to focus on is going to be what happened in like the Latin American or the South American states. And so to get there, I want to kind of do one final look at Iran, just to kind of give some context of the time period. So we're moving later. So looking in the 1970s, Iran had been an American allied state. We had a kind of a friendly dictator in Iran known as the Shah. And in 1979, Islamic fundamentalism kind of swells up into an anti-government revolution, and the Shah is imprisoned and eventually exiled from Iran. And U.S. troops were taken hostage, the Iran hostage situation. A very tumultuous moment in time. Within years, right, we have another conflict called the Iran-Iraq War that breaks out. Saddam Hussein, who we think of as an American enemy, at this time was actually America's ally. He led Iraq to invade Iran. We gave him a lot of weapons, a lot of money, to try to dislodge this radical Islamic fundamentalist state in Iran. And basically Saddam's goal was to have like a united kind of Arab state, right? He was going to try to bring in some of the neighboring nations together into like this pro-Arab state. Iran is not Arab, it's Persian. And so there was kind of a bit of an ethnic twinge to this as well. Eventually, right, it kind of, I would say, ends in relative stalemate. And then we all know that in the 1990s, eventually, when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, America becomes enemies with Saddam Hussein. So then lastly, we look at Latin America. And again, there isn't necessarily independence movements because these nations weren't taken over. But we notice kind of a blossoming or a nationalist vibe in the sense that like we're looking for greater freedoms, greater modernity in a lot of Latin American states. And so in Mexico, we see that, for example, nationalization of things like the oil industry, for example, gave Mexico a greater sense of its own autonomy or its own self-destiny, in the fact that like Americans and foreign investors didn't control their oil industry. Their government controlled the oil industry. And they sometimes refer to that as the Mexican economic miracle. All the way down to the end of the continent, down in Argentina, we have Juan Perón and his wife Evita, right, lead this national militaristic, almost kind of quasi-Nazi looking regime where they tried again to nationalize a lot of industries or push off foreign influence, put a great focus on taking care of their own people, looking at the poor, the treatment of the urban poor especially. There was a lot of suspicion that they modeled the regime after the Nazis. A lot of former Nazis were found and arrested hiding in Argentina. So those are kind of, some questionable moments about the state. And eventually they'll kind of run into some problems with places like Britain, as they both claim access to certain territories like the Falkland Islands, for example. And then lastly, I use Nicaragua as a springboard into this concept of women playing a role in revolution or women playing a role in kind of Latin American identity. And so what I'm looking at there is that in a lot of these movements, whether they're for independence or if they're movements against colonial powers or movements for better pay or for redistribution of wealth, women play an increasingly large role in a lot of these Latin states. And so, for example, I showed a Women's Day march there, but we notice in a lot of these Latin states that women become quite vocal leaders in demonstrations for reform. All right, guys, I hope this helped kind of explain the last little bit of decolonization. And we're on to our final topic, globalization. Have a good day.